3, 2, 1.
Hey philosophers, I'm Tam, the Vice President of UNSW Philosophy Society. We're bringing you a new interview series today, and today I'm joined with Professor Peter Slezak, Honorary Associate Professor Peter Slezak. You might know him from his political activism or his distinguished work in the philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. Much of Peter's work is found in challenging our fundamental understanding of science and our brains. And this is an approach that he takes to all aspects of his life as a local political activist and a participant in public discourse. Peter, welcome to the Philosophy Society.
Thanks very much, Dan.
All right, so Peter, as you know, I've spent almost a week admittedly struggling to read through your new book, Spectator and the Cartesian.
I'm sorry it was so hard.
No worries at all. I found it a really good mental exercise, and I quite enjoyed looking at all your citations and researching each of the individual people that you cited. You described your motivation to write your new book as being compelled by a certain conceptual confusion, one distinct from continental philosophy's notorious obscurity. Please walk us through what this confusion was, the premise of your book, if you would.
Yeah, well, I explained that when I was a student, I found a lot of problems in philosophy very difficult and obscure, and I make the joke in the book, in the preface, that it took a while for me to find out it wasn't my fault. I claim that it occurred to me, and in fact, in apparently unrelated areas, there are certain notorious puzzles, and philosophers spend enormous literature and a lot of time trying to sort through these puzzles. And I got interested in a range of them, as one does as a student and later on. And it gradually dawned on me something I thought was extremely interesting, that the puzzles are all related to each other. Not because, for example, visual imagery or decision-making or consciousness are related, or the semantics of natural language. What they have in common is the confusion, a certain source of error, a mistake that the most significant theories make, the leading theorists and the leading theories, I suggest, they're all making the same mistake in unrelated areas. That's a super interesting thing to claim. I mean, it's very controversial, obviously. But anyway, that's the thesis of the book, that there is a mistake. It's not entirely unknown. It turns out, of course, a lot of people have discussed the problem, but they haven't seen that the same problem can arise in apparently unrelated areas.
Right, and as I understand it, you wrote this book in response to specifically Dennett's arguments on consciousness, specifically as it relates to the homunculus error in the Cartesian theory.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, my book is a tribute to Dennett, because he's a brilliant philosopher and perhaps the most important writer in this area. But it occurred to me gradually that Dennett makes two mistakes, and they're extremely interesting mistakes.
Would you like to walk us through these two mistakes?
Yeah. The first mistake is he describes the concern that he has, the mistake he thinks is going on in literature, as the Cartesian theater error. It's actually a version of what his teacher, Gilbert Ryle, described as the problem or the mistake of the ghost in the machine, the idea that there's a homunculus, a little person inside that is the recipient of all of the conscious experiences. So the ghost in the machine was the famous dismissive phrase that Gilbert Ryle used. And Dennett developed that into his exposition of the Cartesian theater error. So in my book, I claim that the two mistakes that Dennett makes are, one, Descartes wasn't guilty of that error. In fact, philosophers don't read his Descartes' physiology and anatomy books. They're obsolete in a certain sense. They read the Meditations and the Discourse and a few other things, but they don't pay attention to the, for example, the Treatise of Man, the Traité de l'Homme, and the Dioptrics, the Dioptic. And that's where Descartes shows that, in fact, he wasn't guilty of the homunculus error. In fact, he was the one that explained how it arises. And that's the second mistake that Dennett makes. So his wonderfully famous expositions of the homunculus error, he describes in talks he gives, lectures he gives. He puts up a slide from the movie Men in Black, and he shows that they open a robot there, and there's this little character inside there. And he says, look, the mistake of the homunculus is to assume that there's a little person inside that is the locus of conscious experience and so on. And that's been the notorious source of the homunculus error, which has been known for a long time in philosophy, and Dennett gives wonderful expositions of it.
And to be clear, this little man, we're not talking about an actual physiological...
No, it's a little creature, but it's a little full consciousness. In other words, and it's question-begging, the idea that you explain consciousness by a little consciousness is no progress.
Something filtering our experiences.
Well, somebody who's the source of our experiences, actually, the experiences are all residing in this little person. But clearly that begs the question, as we say. And Dennett famously showed that you can't explain consciousness by positing a little consciousness. So he famously has an account of how you solve that problem. And he says, you do postulate a consciousness, but it's a lesser, smaller, more stupid consciousness. And in fact, what you have is the full conscious mind is explained by a bunch of lesser intelligences, and then you reduce each one of those. You discharge the homunculi. That's what he called it.
Almost in like, is this almost like an infinite recursion?
It's not infinite. The whole point is precisely.
Yeah.
Dennett makes a wonderful argument. He's very famous for this, that the way you solve, he says, you can't do psychology without homunculi, but you can't do it with homunculi either. It's an interesting paradox. He states that in one of his papers. So you can't do it without homunculi because you've got to postulate certain elements, entities inside the mind, but you can't do it with homunculi unless you get rid of them. And his famous argument is you discharge them by degrees, so that each a unit that requires intelligence is shown itself to be made up of smaller intelligences until you reduce them, you discharge them, he says, down to simply switches going on and off. At that point, you've got rid of intelligence because now you're down to just, some digital switch that goes on and off. That's no longer intelligence. So his solution to the homunculus problem was to show that you start with lesser homunculi and each one gets reduced to even more stupid ones until there are none left.
So this would be like a monist approach to the mind problem.
Well, it is. He's certainly a materialist.
Mm-hmm.
But my point in criticism of Dennett on that score is that his idea that the homunculus error is by postulating a little intelligence inside is not the way the homunculus error works. And in fact, people who are accused of it regularly dismiss this as saying, look, of course we don't postulate little intelligences.
It sounds absurd.
Well, it's obviously a mistake. And the people guilty of it repudiate this. For example, Koslin in imagery. I spent a lot of time working on the imagery problem. And they're constantly accused of a homunculus mistake, and they're very pissed off about it. And they say, look, of course we know it's a computer model, and computer models don't have any homunculi. The problem with Dennett's criticism is that the mistake isn't what you put into your theory, it's what you leave out.
Leave out.
Now, let me explain that a little bit. The homunculus error is not postulating a little intelligence inside. It's not noticing that the model relies on your intelligence. This is a very different understanding. The theory is not complete, not because there's a little smart guy inside, because you're doing some of the work. The theorist doesn't notice.
Smart guy.
Well, you're the theorist, and you don't realize that in the case of vision or language, I'll get to how this generalizes, but the homunculus error is relying on the theorist's intelligence, and the model in that sense is not complete. It's not that something you put in it, it's what you've left out.
Right.
It's a crucial difference.
To be clear, so in reducing this little person's, this homunculi's intelligence down to reducible little steps of lesser intelligences until, as you said, it's dispelled, they've left out the actual greater consciousness, the greater intelligence of us as the...
Well, sort of. The point is that part of the job, let me give you a concrete example.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of visual imagery, there's a huge literature on how that works. And the idea that it works because there's a little person in there who's looking at the screen can't be right. But the theorists rightly point out they're not postulating a little person inside. What they don't notice, and Dennett missed, is that it's you, the theorist, that can see the screen.
Right.
You use your visual apparatus to see a picture. So the postulating of a picture is a mistake, not because you put a little intelligence inside that can see it. It's because you on the outside can see it. You don't realize that the postulate of a picture can't work because it depends on the theorist understanding it. Now, let me expand this briefly. Once you understand that the homunculus isn't what you put in, but what you're relying on as the theorist,
right,
it turns out it doesn't only arise in the case of consciousness. It took me a while to realize why the same problem seems to arise in a range of different, apparently unrelated areas.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you realize that the theorist is depending on his or her own intelligence, that can arise in different areas of cognition, vision. Not all. I mean, if you're worrying about your kidneys, it doesn't come up. But where there's a cognitive ability that you can use your own cognitive apparatus for, in vision, in understanding language, in making decisions. It turns out you don't notice that you are the theorist relying on your ability. Now, it turns out Chomsky referred to this years ago. He said that a grammar can't work if it's, or at least let me go back again. He says that traditional grammars only worked when they were paired with a reader and an understander of the language.
Right.
And they didn't notice that. Traditional grammars didn't work because they weren't independently autonomous as a theory. They weren't complete because they didn't notice that the theorist understands the language. Now, that was Chomsky making the point years ago about the inadequacy of certain grammars, the ways of theorizing about language.
Right.
Nothing to do with homunculus. But the mistake noticed Chomsky was pointing to was the error of not noticing that you're doing the work, not the theory. The theory has to be fully explicit and work without you, so to speak.
This kind of reminds me of something that one of my friends was actually talking about recently. Essentially, you know the commutator rule in like mathematics, like a plus b equals b plus a, or a times b equals b times a. When you're coding that commutator rule in programming, computers actually struggle greatly to recognize that these two statements, a times b, is equivalent to the statement of b times a. But we intuitively seem to understand that as a children, when we're learning mathematics early on, and like the age of like 4 or 5, is this kind of like a similar thing coming on here?
I don't think it's quite like that. Let me give a loose analogy. It's a very loose, crude analogy. It's like you're looking for your glasses and don't notice you're wearing them. You don't notice that you are actually doing some crucial work. I'll give you another example. Well, my book consists of a bunch of chapters where I show that in apparently unrelated areas, the same problem arises where the theorist is relying on their own intelligence. So, for example, in the semantics of natural language, the most important theory in philosophy has been developed by Donald Davidson. One philosopher describes it as the only semantics we've got in philosophy. But it turns out that his theory is expressed in what's called a meta-language.
Right.
So the Davidson and the consensus among philosophers about semantics, although it's very controversial, is that this meta-language is a theory of the semantics, the meaningfulness of natural language. But the meta-language is one that you have to be able to speak. Wait a minute. So the meta-language is one that the theorist understands? Of course, Chomsky says this. I mean, you can't do theory like that where it depends inherently on the intelligence of the theorist. Well, that's the problem. That's the conflict between Chomsky's way of doing linguistics and semantics and, let's say, the main philosophical view in the case of Davidson and Quine, in fact. It turns out Davidson and Quine have a very similar view about how to do semantics of natural language. They've got slightly different theories, radical translation and radical interpretation, but they agree with each other about the fundamental problem. And it's interesting because both of them accept that it has to be relative to an understander, a native speaker of the language. Well, that's not a theory. That's not an adequate theory in the objective sense,
right?
In what Chomsky calls the Galilean sense. If you're doing science, it can't depend on your own contribution to the theory. It has to be independent.
It has to be independent, yep. That makes sense. And considering that we pointed out the dependence that this theory has on our own perception, the work we're doing as the perceiver in a
That's right. So the musculus is not inside, it's you outside.
Ourselves. Yep. Yeah. That makes sense. And considering that, what other alternative views do you have on the mind-body problem? And what are your thoughts on like dualism and even Descartesian dualism or even panpsychism and such?
Well, let's see, where do we begin? Firstly, it's important to say that my book makes a lot of the fact that Descartes has been badly misunderstood. I mean, I have chapter and articles I published on the cogito, which I think have been misunderstood, but it's a whole separate story. But in relation to his theories of mind, he has a complete, exhaustive reductionism. He went very far in trying to reduce everything in the world down to particles and their interactions bouncing around according to
matter as extension.
Matter as extension and simply the interactions of particles. Of course, with the human mind, there was one obstacle to that, which was the fact that there seems to be one aspect of the human mind which can't be reduced to physical motions and interactions of matter, and that's our conscious awareness, the idea that thinking seems to be independent of matter. That's the famous cogito ergo sum. But he was led to that by a perfectly plausible kind of scientific reasoning, that it seems that there's a function that transcends the possibilities of physical behavior, of mechanical processes. And so it was a perfectly plausible understanding. In particular, let me be specific. He realized that language has certain properties that can't be explained as he understood by mechanical processes. That's what we today call the creativity of language, the infinite capacity for making utterances that were not causally or independently generated by previous events. They seem to come out of nowhere.
They appear as emergent qualities, however.
Well, they can't be explained physically because they're novel. And Chomsky later pointed out that this was a deep insight, that Descartes couldn't have understood that this infinite capacity, this generativity we call it today, could be possibly produced by machines, but we had to have the idea of a computer before that became possible.
Right.
And once the idea of Turing and Turing machines became possible, we could see how the infinite generativity is possible in a mechanical way.
In a mechanical sense, yeah.
You can't blame Descartes for not having been Turing. So Descartes had an important understanding of the limitations of mechanical devices. I mean, let me be a bit more specific. He said that no matter how complex a piece of machinery, clockwork is, it can only do a finite number of things.
Absolutely.
No matter how big the clockwork is, there are only gears and levers and pulleys, and there's a finite repertoire. But to go back to the point I was making, we seem to have an infinite repertoire.
Yeah.
So how could we have an infinite capacity given the finite means? Well, that's what Chomsky shows is exactly the fundamental basis for the mechanics of language when you have a recursive process.
I've read a bit into this earlier this year, and I think there was one theory that I found interesting. It was integrated information theory, the sense that a lot of the data that we process and all this infinite potential that we have, not only in language but in thought, comes from not specifically the neurons and matter itself, but the way that they're connected to each other and the different connections and the way that our neurons connect to each other within our minds over and over again. The more dense those connections are, the greater the potential permutations become, so to speak. Are there any theories or thoughts that you have on dualism or panpsychism that you think would help solve, or potentially any personal headcanons on the subject to explain away this infinite potential?
Well, look, dualism has become popular again. It used to be unfashionable in philosophy. And then people like David Chalmers and various others revived it because they thought that materialism can't explain the introspective, qualitative features of consciousness. So they resorted to alternatives. I think they're all mistaken. And one of the desperate moves is to postulate panpsychism. And so panpsychism is, okay, consciousness is a mystery. You're basically a physicalist or a materialist, and you think the whole world is made up of physics and chemistry. So how can you explain consciousness? Well, maybe everything's conscious. That's such a crazy idea. I mean, it's sort of like you cannot figure out how to explain consciousness except by maybe postulating everything is conscious. This is very popular among leading philosophers. But I think it's a kind of a mistake. And the reason is that on everybody's account, Chalmers, Strawson, all the leading people who are panpsychists, even I think Thomas Nagel, they acknowledge that consciousness is something that is a first-person, introspective, qualitative feature of one's own experience. You only know it in your own case. Now that means that there's no need to postulate it as some feature of the universe. Like Chalmers and others will say, it's like charge and mass and various other physical properties. Somehow, consciousness has got to be another physical property. But that's making it objective, whereas in fact, consciousness is only known in one case, which is your own introspective experience.
Yeah.
So now to explain that is not so difficult if you take seriously the introspective nature of it. There was a very well-known paper many years ago by a guy called Keith Gunderson, and the title of the paper was Asymmetries and Mind-Body Perplexities. And he explained that there's a fundamental asymmetry between how you know everything in the world and how you know your own consciousness. So in other words, the fact that you have an introspective access to your own mind, it shouldn't be elevated to being some principle of the whole universe. It's a function. Now, the point about this is that any computer would have the same paradox about itself. And Gunderson makes this point that if you have a kind of what he calls a self-scanning scanner, you can scan the whole universe, but you'll have a kind of a logical puzzle about yourself. That's a logical feature of the asymmetry between investigating, looking at inspecting everything, and how you can't inspect yourself the way you can inspect everything else. But that doesn't require postulating some fundamental properties of matter. That's just a information processing feature of a system. A system can't look at itself the way... And by the way, Wittgenstein made this point in his Tractatus. He has a little picture of an eye and the world view, or the visual field. And the one thing that an eye can't see is itself. But that's not beyond physics. It's not like you have to postulate some alternative principle in the universe to postulate the paradox of not being able to see your own eye, directly. With a mirror, you can see it. So that's actually Wittgenstein's metaphor. And it's the one Gunderson develops to show that, yes, there's an inherent asymmetry, kind of logical paradox about how you understand yourself and understand the rest of the world. But you don't elevate this into some cosmic physical principle that permeates the whole universe, and therefore every atom or something else has to be conscious. It's like a crazy alternative to a puzzle that has a better explanation.
It's definitely very out there. I've personally struggled with kind of trying to understand.
There's no evidence for it.
Yeah.
Panpsychism is just a desperate measure to explain what appears to be a fundamental mystery of the universe. But it's not a fundamental mystery. By the way, there's a very good book that captures this. It became unfashionable. There used to be two problems of the mind. One was the mind-body problem, and the other one used to be the other mind's problem. Now, it became unfashionable because the question became, so you know your own mind, but how do you know that somebody else has a mind?
Is this like Levine's open question?
It's Levine's open question, and it's a book by Anita Avramides, and she admits at the front of her book that this question has become unfashionable, but she's reviving it. And that's actually the point. The puzzle, the fundamental puzzle, is not the problem of mind and body. It's the problem of my mind and everything else. And so in the end, other minds are part of the physical world, and there's no reason to have deep mysteries about that, where the only mind that you have what's called direct acquaintance with, as they used to call it, is your own.
Yeah.
But so that solves a lot of problems.
And not only does it solve a lot of problems, as I can see in philosophy itself, but especially as in the way that philosophy and politics intersect, I actually find that this idea of not being able to access the inner lives of other people is something that becomes a key point of concern in politics when you see the othering and the subjugation that people experience on a daily basis and on a larger scale in politics. As most of the time, this comes down to like the invalidation of individuals or collectives, like first-person experience almost. So I was wondering how your philosophy and interest in cognitive science and the philosophy of mind intersects with your own political activism, like day to day.
It doesn't. It doesn't. They're not connected. It's interesting you try to make a kind of a philosophical connection, but
Trying to segue it.
Yeah, no, there's no real connection. That's important to say that, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
You could be a dualist or a panpsychist or anything else and have any view on politics. They're not connected. My political interests come from other sources. It's to do with, one's knowledge of the world, one's sense of justice and human rights and international law, and the moral responsibility.
So, Professor Slezak, Peter, as a philosopher of mind and science, how have you found your studies intersect with your political activism, especially how they inform the way you interpret and process the world?
They don't intersect at all. It's a fair question, but my political interests derive from, a concern about human rights, about international law, about morality. And they're the sort of concerns that everybody ought to have, independently of what you think about dualism or philosophy of science. They're not really connected at all. And that's important. Chomsky years ago wrote a famous article about the responsibility of intellectuals and academics generally. And as citizens, we have responsibilities. And if you take that seriously, you get engaged to some degree in the problems of the world, and particularly where you can make a difference. And that's part of the answer, that you can't solve or even have an impact on a lot of problems around the world. There are problems all over the place that you can't conceivably make a difference to, but there are some that are much more immediate in your life. And I've become engaged in areas where arguably I have a role and I can make some difference. That's the lesson I learned from Chomsky, by the way. He makes that point a lot. People bellyache about the crimes of other people where they can't have any effect, whether it's the Russians or, somebody else. And they tend to ignore their own specific responsibility where it's their country or their own group. And that's where you have a primary responsibility.
I really appreciate you bringing up responsibility in this sense, because in my experience, I would say you're one of the best examples of a political philosopher, not a political philosopher, sorry, a philosopher and academic actually putting their beliefs into practice. There's been a lot of buzz in the news lately of your political experiences, particularly as an anti-Zionist Jewish man outspoken on the Palestinian genocide. In 2015, you were barred from talking about Israel at Limud Oz, and Jewish convention celebrating Jewish thought and experience. And then in 2023, not even like 9 months ago, you were assaulted in Double Bay for speaking out against Israel's war crimes. So ignoring this like blatant conflation of like anti-Zionism and anti-Jewish sentiment, there's an almost unique marginalization that occurs with people who are perceived as educated on certain topics. How much do you think your outspoken political opinions have affected your access and engagement in academia and the public itself? Do you feel like?
It's an interesting question. I don't think, experienced anything in my career that was a consequence of my politics. I haven't been aware of any discrimination or disadvantage as a result of my politics. Some people do. Some people, where even in Australia, have been targeted and penalised in some ways or discriminated against because of their stand, particularly on Palestine. I don't think I've experienced any personal harms or discrimination on that score. And in fact, as an academic, I think we have a responsibility to express our views and to get active in certain ways. But it's part of your broader responsibility as a human being, as a citizen. And so, but as you mentioned, I have a particular responsibility as a Jew. I grew up, and I'm not a very good Jew, I'm an atheist. And I'm never was a practicing Jew. I grew up in a Jewish family, in a Jewish household, and we had the year Passover every year with my family. We did all those things. I had a bar mitzvah. But, I read Bertrand Russell when I was 16, and I became an atheist. And not only that, I recognized that nationalism and the tribal belonging is also a deep problem. So I kind of renounced, in some sense, my Jewishness, not as a historical, cultural fact about my personal biography, but as a tribal thing. And I married a non-Jewish girl, which was a terrible sin, according to the community as it is. So strangely, I have kind of Groucho Marx's view. I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. That's Groucho Marx's famous joke. But that's actually kind of a serious point that other scholars have made, Isaac Deutscher and others. Isaac Deutscher, famous scholar of Trotsky, wrote a biography. He has a famous essay called The Non-Jewish Jew. And he cites Spinoza to talk about philosophy, where Spinoza also saw himself sharing universal values and transcending one's immediate cultural, biographical history. And Edward Said, the famous Palestinian, wrote famously about this need. We all have a culture and a belonging, but one has to transcend that to see one's common humanity. That doesn't sound like it's so difficult, but it obviously is very hard for people. But that has consequences. And when your community are deeply involved in what I think in this case are terrible crimes, we have a responsibility to speak out about it. So I kind of, in a way, embraced my Jewishness in order to resign from it. It was kind of like that Groucho Marx paradox. And by the way, it's worth saying, if we're talking about this, my credentials, as you might say, are kind of good. My parents were both Holocaust survivors. My mother and grandmother survived Auschwitz, and I grew up with their stories. And they have a deep impact on you, but the question is what lesson you learned from that. And my view is that the Jewish communities generally learn the wrong lesson. They have this slogan, as you know, it's widely used, never again. The trouble is that they mean never again to Jews, and that's not the right lesson. The right lesson is obviously never again to anybody, and you have to generalize and apply those principles that we learned about discrimination, about racism. And now, as I often say, we're not the victims currently, we, meaning Jews especially, who are supporting the crimes of the State of Israel, Zionism. We're not the victims this time, we're the perpetrators. And you read Chomsky and various other figures who are deeply engaged in these political conflicts, and you draw the obvious conclusion. Now, of course, I follow admirable examples, people like Norman Finkelstein and the Israeli journalist Amir Haas, who also have Holocaust parents. And they draw the lesson from this, that if we take their experience seriously, we stand up for the Palestinians. And that's become a very critical matter right now, given how horrible things are.
I watched an interview from you from a few years ago. Actually, no, I think it was from last year. And you spoke about how during the Third Reich, there was this concept of the righteous amongst the nation, that there were people who would stand up for the Jewish people during that time, and how it's difficult processing who amongst the Jewish nation are the righteous amongst their nation.
Well, I mentioned a few of them.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a few of them now.
Yeah.
It seems to me that a lot of this seems to be intricately related to almost personal experience with people who've been through similar throughout. As you've mentioned, the journalist that you mentioned and the other person you mentioned, they both have parents with Holocaust experience.
Well, I picked those as an example because they say what I think has to be said. And particularly because the Holocaust is abused, it's exploited to justify the crimes of the State of Israel. That's a scandal. It's to desecrate the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The Palestinians shouldn't pay the price of what the Nazis did. And the idea that we would use that to excuse what Israel does, which sadly the Jewish communities do. They keep citing this history, and the Palestinians are the victims of that in a number of ways. Firstly, the State of Israel was created out of various guilt that the nations had about the Holocaust after the war. I mean, it began a lot earlier in 1917. Herzl, 1909, Herzl, or thereabouts, drafted the idea of a Jewish state, and in 1917 the Balfour Declaration basically gave half of Palestine to the Jews, European Jews. This was a terrible crime, and the Palestinians have been suffering because of that, and now even more than ever. So, I mean, what's going on now is a horror. I mean, after all, the International Court of Justice has currently declared what's going on as a probable genocide. We can't look the other way. The whole point is we can't simply cast our gaze aside from that, especially as a Jew. I mean, I wouldn't want to assert my Jewishness as an atheist philosopher, except for the fact that they're claiming to do it on behalf of Jews. So you can't just be quiet about that.
There's a almost conflation between Zionism and Judaism.
Oh, there is, and that's deliberate.
Yep.
They want to make out, I mean, the state proclaimed in 2018 the nation state law. Can you imagine Israel, as it is today, proclaimed a nation state law which said it is the state of the Jewish people only? Well, that's an open apartheid claim, apart from the actual discrimination inside Israel proper, pre-1948. And there are dozens of laws on the books which discriminate against the Palestinians, and that's just inside Israel where they're living relatively well. The West Bank is much worse than apartheid. It's a military occupation, a brutal occupation. They're rampaging around there, demolishing houses, shooting dead unarmed civilians. 2 kids a week are shot dead until recently, probably more now. And Gaza much worse. I mean, especially now. Gaza has been worse for a long time. It's been actually a brutal and criminal siege. It was under what's called belligerent occupation, which is a crime in international law. And that's been allowed to fester for 17 years now. So this is a major catastrophe. And if it's done on behalf of Jews, the Jewish state has the Star of David and claims to be acting on behalf of Jews.
All Jews.
Well, you can't just be quiet.
Not only is this like a major catastrophe, but it seems wholly unique in the sense that the way people have responded to it and perceived this specific case of genocide is so far removed from how previous genocides have been.
Well, look, one could argue about whether you use the word genocide and comparing it to others. It doesn't matter about the term exactly.
Of course.
The scale, just the facts on the ground. If you list the horrors of this military brutality, it's just hair-raising, and it's not getting enough attention. And the other thing that's worth saying is that, again, the Jewish communities, the Zionist communities, abuse the charge of anti-Semitism by accusing anybody of anti-Semitism if they criticize the state of Israel. There's a notorious definition, the IHRA definition, which is now being accepted by universities and governments, which actually lists among the examples of anti-Semitism half a dozen cases of criticizing Israel. Well, criticizing a state for its crimes is not racism of any form, and this is a weapon, a stick to beat over the head and to silence criticism of horrible crimes.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned how this situation doesn't seem to be getting enough attention. However, as we've seen throughout social media and everything, though, the buzz is there. Like, I'm not sure if you remember, but there was the whole All Eyes on Rafah image that spread to almost 50 million people, I believe. People reposted that. And how do you feel about this almost like commodification of political violence and catastrophes? Like, with the use of AI in particular in this instance, like if 50 million people reposted an AI image, and yet I'd like to see an example of like 50 million people actually resharing real images and footage of...
Yeah, well, the real footage is being shared online. It's not in the mainstream. In Australia, the ABC is not shows the odd picture. But if you watch, as I do, too much social media, even Al Jazeera and even some of the US corporate outlets, media, they're showing much more than we're seeing here in Australia. And it's so horrifying that it's a bit hard to deal with the grotesque suffering of the Palestinians. I mean, bereaved parents, children being dragged out of the rubble, limp dead bodies. I mean, thousands. We're talking about over 40,000 people have been killed. Some 15 or 20,000 of those are children. And this is a horror which is not getting enough outrage. And our government, I have to say, have been shameful about this. They haven't called for a ceasefire. They've allowed this to go on under various, excuses. So they're very much to be criticised.
Absolutely. And you have a very interesting perspective in all this, not only because of your position as a Jewish man and as a spoken critic of Israel, but as I understand it, literally 2 months before October 7th, you were in Palestine, in Beirut, filming a documentary, Dare to Struggle, living amongst the Palestinian people and understanding the struggle. What was it like you experiencing life in Palestine itself only months before this catastrophe unfolded?
I've been there a few times, and this recent time the documentary is actually called Palestine Under Siege. And we started filming before the October 7th events happened. And we were traveling in the West Bank. Of course, we lived in the old city of Jerusalem, which is interesting. We traveled to Hebron, which is the worst example of the military occupation there. I can talk about that, but that's pretty grim. There's two sides to traveling in Palestine. Firstly, moving among the Palestinian people is a wonderful experience. The warmth, the hospitality, just the experience of being with the Palestinians, who are really living in a very difficult situation in the West Bank, where the military rampages around. So, for example, in the old city where we lived in the Austrian hospice, just on the Via Dolorosa, just outside the door, you can see in the documentary, I'm walking out of the door, right there, there's a military barrier with the soldiers standing behind there, and I walked past them in the documentary. After I left there, I'm in contact with a young woman who's actually living in the old city, but she commutes to Ramallah, where her husband is. She reported to me that a young 15-year-old was shot dead, and they let him bleed out and didn't let the ambulance come in. That's happening standardly in the West Bank. So they're suffering, enormously. The military just rampage around the place, shooting and tormenting people and demolishing houses to displace them from the whole of the West Bank if they can.
Not just displace them, but also supplant them with illegal...
Well, there are yes, it's an important point. There are 700,000 or more illegal settlers in the West Bank. Everyone is in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The world doesn't know anything about it. Our government is silent about it. So, this is a crime on a major scale. It's made the whole question of Palestine very difficult, the question of whether you can even have a Palestinian state. The Palestinians settled for 22% of historical Palestine after 1948, when they had originally partitioned it and given them the majority of Palestine. And then after the war, they ended up with 78% of Palestine. So the two-state solution would be Palestine accepting 22% of their historical Palestine. But the Israelis are quite explicit to say this, because most people don't, especially our government, don't acknowledge. The Likud party, that's the governing party, have explicitly in their charter that there will be no Palestinian state from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean. That's their political program. Netanyahu has repeatedly, as all of them have said, there is no intention to acknowledge or allow a Palestinian state.
Not only that, but the rhetoric has been inherently violent and genocide.
No, of course. But even besides the genocide, the fact that our politicians accept this gaslighting, this charade, that there's talk of even currently, let's get back to the negotiating table and go for 2 states. The Israelis have made it very clear they have absolutely no intention. So why do we proceed with this pretense that there's... Now, by the way, the peace process, so-called, has been a fraud. There's been lots written about this, that it was always engineered by the Americans. In fact, there's a book by the famous American Palestinian called Rashid Khalidi. He's got a book called Brokers of Deceit. The Americans haven't been fair brokers in this dispute. They've rigged it so that it's always favoring. And now Israel runs the whole place and has no intention of relinquishing anything. So that's the reality, apart from the immense brutality. So where does one stand on this? What does one do? It's not even clear what the end is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's pretty incredibly validating to hear an actual academic, intellectual actually speak on this topic, especially since you've had like your own personal experience throughout all this. I don't even know where to go from this.
Well, maybe you asked me about what else in Palestine, traveling around there. I don't know whether I should say something more about that.
Mm-hmm.
Said that being in Palestine is on the one hand inspiring. The Palestinians have a word for their attitude. It's sumud, with steadfastness, and they show an immense courage and psychological capacity to live their lives under the most awful conditions. That's part of the experience of traveling in Palestine. I interviewed a couple of interesting people. One of them is Hanan Ashrawi, the famous figure that was one of the leaders of the Palestinians, and she's very articulate in what's going on. Also a wonderful Palestinian called Salman Abu Sitta, who tells the story of his experience when the Jewish militias came in and during 1948, how they expelled. The 1948 horrors, the Palestinian word for it, the Arabic word is Nakba, which is the catastrophe. That's a hell of a story. Now, that was when they were expelled. 750,000 Palestinians were expelled. What's interesting to say about that, by the way, is a lot of them are still holding the keys to their house, which Jews are now living in.
Oh, wow.
I, as an Australian Jew, have nothing to do with Israel. I have more rights than those Palestinians who were expelled.
I think it's back on birthright, right? You have an actual birthright too.
Well, there's the Israelis made up a law, the law of return. It doesn't have any real international status, but they acknowledge that every Jew has a right to go and become a citizen of Israel. Well, I reject that. I have no rights there. And my Palestinian friends don't have that right, and their house is still there, and they're still holding the key. There's a shocking situation which is allowed to persist. I don't know how decent people can tolerate this. And sadly, too many Jewish people somehow embrace this without understanding. Part of the problem, I have to say, is the ignorance of the history. The history of it is only relatively recently becoming exposed. So a couple of historians, important figures like the Israeli Ilan Pappé, Avi Schlein, these are Israeli historians, and Benny Morris even, they started to tell the story of 1948 and how different it is from what we all grew up with. I mean, we all grew up in my age group with essentially the story that was portrayed in a movie called Exodus. It was based on a novel by Leon Uris. It's this total fiction about what happened in 1948. That's been a shock for Jews and for Israelis too, except it's still kind of not allowed to talk about the Nakba, this 1948, because it was a disaster. It was an atrocity on a large scale. I mean, there are the notorious cases like Deir Yassin, a village where they went and they massacred all of the, civilians. There were several massacres that have recently come out. Tantura Beach, they massacred peaceful Palestinians in a shocking way. So it turns out the whole history of Palestine is different from what we all and the general public understand.
Yeah.
You go back to 1917, the Balfour Declaration is completely different. They gave away Palestine, contrary to the promises they made to the Arabs. The Arabs rose up against the Turks, the Ottomans, with Lawrence of Arabia, a famous movie about it, because they were promised that they would run their lands but they were betrayed by the British. The British gave Palestine to the European Jews. Well, that's where it began. So it didn't begin on October 7th. It didn't begin even in 1948. In 1917 already, these developments were beginning. 1948 was much worse than anybody's understood. The Arab armies, it's always described as a miracle that Israel, this fledgling state that was declared in 15th or 14th of May 1948, was suddenly attacked by all these forces. Well, actually, before the 14th of May, they had already expelled, ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. So the war didn't begin because they declared the state of Israel. They were expelling Palestinians to begin with before the war, before the state was even declared. So, and interestingly, Abu Shleim in his book points out that the Israeli or the Jewish forces were militarily superior throughout the whole struggle. So it wasn't a miracle. The Arab armies, the combined Arab forces, were outclassed, outgunned, and they never had a chance. So, of course, it ended the way it did, and they ended up taking 78% of the country. Well, 1967, all of the wars, the whole history is different, without giving you the whole rich history.
Yeah.
That's important to understand, so that if you want to take a moral position on this, it's important to understand what the real history is.
And I'm sure we'll cite like all of these sources in like the description or whatever for this video.
There's endless literature on this, if anybody bothers to read it.
Get it from...
And Ilan Pappé is one of the most important. He's got a kind of a short little primer on this, but all of these are worth reading. And I'm mentioning Jewish Israeli scholars. You don't have to regard this as somehow, Arab propaganda.
Yeah.
This is scholars who are themselves, in this case, several. Another one, she was a linguist. I'm blocking on her name now. She wrote an important book about the peace process. So there are these sources which are Jewish and Israeli sources that you can read that really there's no controversy about.
Well, this is all fascinating to hear. I'll be frank, this is the first time I'm hearing about half of this alternate history that I didn't even realize that not even ourselves, but the Jewish people themselves have been growing up with this. Yeah.
That's the way Israelis are educated, the way all of us, but not just the Jewish communities. As I say, that Hollywood movie, Exodus, tells this fictional story about, the theme song of the movie, if you look it up. I remember it in my age group, it was a big hit in the movies. The theme song, the lyrics are, "This land is our land, God gave this land to me." These are the Jews coming from Europe. That's the refugees, like my parents. My uncle, I have another video that I made there, a documentary, where my uncle, he has the tattoo on his arm from Auschwitz, and he tells me that he arrived there on the day that the State of Israel was declared. So there are these refugees, these wretched victims of the Holocaust. They turn up there, but the movie tells the story about they came to a land, and the slogan, "This is a land without people, for a people without a land." That's such bullshit.
Yeah.
But that's the story. So that's 48. And as I say, it's not just the Jews. Hollywood tells this story, and the whole world accepts this as the narrative. And so the Zionist organizations have been playing on this misinformation still. They lie about everything.
And that's what makes it even more important to have these conversations and open dialogue.
Well, people need to read. You need to get informed. It's not that easy, by the way. It turns out it's often, people ask, how can I figure it out? Well, I guess that's a good question. You got to read, and I don't discourage reading the Zionist story. When I give talks about this, I put up a picture of Alan Dershowitz, a famous American lawyer, and I put up opposite him, Chomsky or Finkelstein. Well, it's a fair question. You get a completely different story from the two of them. You have to do your homework. I mean, I'm not going to tell somebody what to believe.
Absolutely.
But if you make a minimum effort, it becomes pretty obvious where the truth lies. Otherwise, why would they lie about it? Why would they? If I have debates, for example, in the literature with some of the Zionist leaders, it's very interesting. I'll publish a piece in response to one of the Zionist leaders, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and I'll list, as I mentioned before, all of the crimes that the State of Israel is committing, uncontroversial, killings and house demolitions, and they never come back and deny it. Their game is to ignore the facts and rely on the fact that people don't know those facts, and then come back and tell me that I'm not telling the truth or that those facts are not true. That's the game. And apart from the other tactic, which is worth mentioning, they rely on smearing people. They want to call you an anti-Semite. They want to call you a Jew hater or something. Right, that's not an answer. That's not an appropriate response to the factual claims of the crimes, the atrocities that Israel is committing. So in some sense, it's not that difficult to figure out what's going on. In fact, let me quote Chomsky. I often quote him in this context. During the Vietnam War, he said several things that were very powerful. He said, you only have to know the number of bombs that were dropped on South Vietnam or maybe Cambodia to know that this is a major atrocity. Just the tonnage of ordnance that was dropped. Well, you only have to look at a picture of Gaza. You don't have to know anything to see. The entire civilian infrastructure, buildings as far as the eye can see, are reduced to rubble. You don't have to know anything more than that to know that this is not about Hamas. It's not about terrorism. Tel Aviv is not reduced to rubble. The whole of Gaza is now unlivable. That's all you have to know to see that this is an atrocity. So it's not that hard. The question really for me is, why don't people react to it? That's a deep and puzzling question. Both Jews and others, why looking at this, because even the minimum attention paid in the mainstream media, you only have to see one of those photographs and ask, what the fuck is going on?
I mean, one photo changed everyone's opinions on the Vietnam War.
What did?
Napalm go with the Vietnam War? That completely revolutionized people's perception of that.
Yeah. But you only have to see...
We've had so many napalm goes in Gaza over the first year.
Well, again, the extent of the destruction makes you stop and think, how can this possibly be justified when talking about civilians? And by the way, one of the other things that's relevant here is some of the Israeli leaders will get up and say, they think this is helping their case. They'll say, look what we did at Dresden. Look what we did in Hiroshima. And they'll pick major war crimes that we were responsible for to justify what they're doing. Well, Dresden was a war crime. By the way, in the Nuremberg trials, we didn't bring the charges of certain kinds of mass murder against the Germans because we committed them worse than they did.
Right.
That's an interesting fact about the Nuremberg trials. The bombing of Germany, we bombed civilians.
Carpet bombed.
They were major war crimes.
Yeah.
And not to mention Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So imagine now the Israelis, this perverted moral kind of mindset, they'll actually cite that to justify what they're doing. This is bizarre.
Line violation.
And actually, I grew up not understanding this properly. I grew up thinking Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified. Well, that's shocking. That tells you how you can make people somehow lose any sense of decency.
Yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance to that, for sure.
Yeah.
It's only our hope that through conversation and reading, or
you start to think of it differently. Not many people.
I know I'm thinking of it differently.
Yeah, but it's easy for you. You're not invested in it like my Jewish friends. You know, I've tried over the years. It's a very interesting conversation to have. The ones that are willing to talk to me, as you mentioned, not everybody's willing to go. But a lot are, and with goodwill, we sit around and we exchange articles, and it's a bit depressing to come to the conclusion. I've made no progress with people.
Oh, wow.
So, and I said to one friend, it's kind of funny, we went through a long process of exchanging articles and arguing over lunches together, and I said to him once, his name was also Peter. He was a sophisticated guy, by the way. He is a diplomat and has important credentials and knowledgeable. And I said to him, Peter, we're not making any progress. I said, one of us is wrong about everything. One of us is completely wrong about everything. That's a really interesting situation. Where do you begin to, one of us has to change our views about this.
Yeah.
That's a real difficult.
And what's the motivation that's clinging on to trying to connect to us? Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is a matter of people making a conscientious effort. I've done this with several people, and there's not a lot of meeting, which is a bit worrying, because you think it's sort of pretty clear. But there's a lot of literature. I've been interested in the psychology of this. It's to do with, I think, tribal allegiance, a kind of belonging. There's a lot of psychological literature about people's identification with a group and their unwillingness to abandon that sense of belonging and the righteousness of their cause. It's a deep psychological thing. Maybe I was lucky because I wasn't brought up with that kind of tribal attitude. So it's an accident of one's biography. And the Jewish friends that I have talked to, they're much more deeply engaged in the belonging to the community. That's why Edward Said made that point, that you have to try to transcend that.
Yeah.
And see the humanity. You think it's sort of a truism. Is it so hard to see the humanity on the other side? Well, it sort of is.
And that kind of perfectly leads back to like that Levine's open question, like how do you understand other people's like inner workings and inner life?
So there is a segue there after all. Back to philosophy of mind.
Oh yeah, I found it.
Yeah. Well, that's a different question. That's how you decide that other people are some people or not robots.
Yeah, but that's exactly what we see happening in like Palestine. They're not being treated as people.
That's very hard to explain.
Yeah.
Leave aside Levine and robots. I mean, I think that's should be easier. But no, your question is the right one. It's very... Look, I grew up with my parents' stories of the Nazis treating them, I mean, literally, into the gas chambers. And and it was always, how could Germans be treating other people like this? Well, I know the answer now. It's very awkward to say this, but watching what we are doing in Gaza, not only in Gaza, around the world elsewhere,
Of course.
but that's the one I'm engaged in, how they can brutalize people, children, and not care, and the general public is not doing it or watching it. That's something deeply disturbing about how you can regard other people as not fully human.
Yeah.
I to be honest, I don't quite get it.
I don't think any of us ever will, at least in this room.
No, well, it's a serious problem. I mean, look, in Vietnam too, we grew up with the stories of the dehumanization, the capacity to commit crimes on a vast scale against other people. Maybe you tell yourself some story that they're all evil and they all deserve it. They talk that way. See, Israeli leaders talk about the Palestinians as animals.
It's very explicit.
And that justifies, and the racism and the exterminationist attitudes are a little bit shocking. You do these vox pops in the streets there, young people will say, drop a nuke on the whole of Gaza.
Yeah.
Go figure. And the trouble is, if you don't mix the other things, communities tend to be separate from one another. If you know enough people in the other community, obvious, you can't regard them as not people. But communities tend not to mix with each other.
Mm.
That was one of the features of traveling in Palestine. But here too, I happen to be proud to know very many Palestinians that I'm very fond of. My Jewish friends don't know any.
Mm.
So they're in the community, they're more susceptible to these biases, which we all are prone to. It's very tough.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Peter. So besides your documentary and the new book, is there anything new you're working on currently?
Yeah, I'm working on a very interesting and important project, actually. I'm writing an intellectual biography of Noam Chomsky.
Oh, wow.
It's an interesting moment. Sadly, Chomsky has become ill, and we started working on this. I'm doing it with a co-author. I'm going to be responsible for the philosophy, the linguistics, and the psychology side of Chomsky's intellectual work. It's an intellectual biography, so we're not going to talk about his life and, other aspects of his personal life. It's like other intellectual biographies. It's about his enormously controversial views about everything. And he's argued with the top philosophers, with Quine and Davidson and Kripke. This is very important for philosophers because he's sort of a renegade and he's controversial in the sense that mainstream philosophers don't accept his views about language.
Is that a 5-Soap exclusive? Have you spoken about this with anyone else, this new book you're working on?
Oh yeah. So for example, even in linguistics, his views among linguists is not universally shared. So everything he has done is very controversial. And this is an ambitious work which is not just to give an exposition of Chomsky's ideas, but to engage with his critics. And I think he basically wins the arguments. So it's a very partisan book. But being partisan doesn't mean it's not objective. And the way we want to be objective is to give a fair hearing to his critics. Mm. And so both the the most important philosophers disagree with Chomsky, Kripke on language, naming and stuff like that. And Quine, he had big arguments with Quine and Davidson. So that's a huge, interesting project. And I'm collaborating with another academic who's going to write on his politics. So it's a very big work that's going to look at his debates. And of course, in politics, there's a big story to tell, beginning in the Vietnam War. And he's written about, Vietnam and the Middle East and Latin America, the crimes there. So that's a very interesting story, again, given his particular role in exposing the crimes for which we're responsible. So this is a very ambitious work, and it's very natural for me because I've spent a lot of my time working on Chomsky's ideas, both in linguistics and in philosophy. So this is a very interesting project.
That's fascinating to hear. Looking forward to it. How long do you reckon it will be until this new work's out?
Very hard to say. We've gone a long way. I've written already several draft notes up, beginning from the very outset. Chomsky's first published book was Syntactic Structures in 1957. That's kind of interesting because it was just a kind of a primer for students. It was based on a very much larger work that he only published many years later. And I've written draft notes up until about the mid-60s or 70, his major works, including his famous review of Skinner that killed off psychology at the time. He wrote one review of Skinner's behaviorism, and that ended behaviorism almost single-handedly. It's an amazing story. That gives you an insight into Chomsky's genius, actually, and telling that story and going into the details of the review. I've done it with students, and in fact, I quote somebody who said, you have to have lived through that review and its impact to have understood how traumatic it was. They say that. This guy, psychologist, says how traumatic it was for psychologists. How come nobody noticed? Chomsky's showing that behavioral psychology is not just wrong, it's empty. He uses the phrase play acting at science.
Wow.
Pretty tough. Now, when there's a change in science, like, when Einstein revised Newtonian physics, it wasn't like that. It was not showing that Newton was play acting at science. This is much worse.
Oh, yeah.
And the interesting question, again, this does connect with politics. How come nobody noticed?
Yeah.
When you read the review, like the guy says, it's traumatic, but it's sort of obvious. How come nobody noticed? That's Chomsky's genius. He sees things with a penetrating clarity that other people don't see. So that's the story we're telling. I'm telling that part of the story. And it's important for philosophers because for philosophers, language is a central concern. The biggest topics and biggest names in philosophy are people like Quine and Davidson and Kripke. Chomsky thinks they're all wrong.
Yeah.
And that's quite in my book, to get back to promoting my book, I've got a chapter on Kripke and Davidson, two separate chapters. And basically, of course, I side with Chomsky on what is wrong with those particular philosophical views.
And for a more fun note, I suppose, in 2009, you did a fun exercise in the science of philosophical communication, where you put on a retrial of Galileo in Galileo's attempt at convincing the church of heliocentrism. Now, I actually went and watched the broadcast, and then the ABC filmed it at the time. And not only did it seem like such a fun project, but I think it's such a great initiative to try and make the philosophy of science and philosophy itself more accessible to the general public. Now, you're talking about breaking down Chomsky's entire intellectual discourse, and you're talking about how the emptiness of behavioralism in psychology, and these all seem like fascinating topics. What would it take, you reckon, for like similar initiatives like your retrial of Galileo to take the public stage and introduce more people to these ideas?
Well, let me talk about the Galileo thing for a minute. It's philosophically interesting because he was promoting a view that was heretical. He was tried by the Inquisition, the Catholic Church, for heresy. And he was very important in the history of this. The Catholic Church, the credit took them a few hundred years, but they finally came around and accepted that. And they accepted a fundamental distinction that Galileo wanted to make. He wanted to separate questions of science from questions of faith and morals. That was a radical thing because the church hadn't distinguished those. And Galileo paid the price. Of course, since then the church has accepted that faith and morals is one thing that the scriptures and the tradition and the fathers of the church are authoritative about. But science and nature is something which we have to rely on our own senses and our own intelligence. So that was the point of that. And lots of interesting philosophical questions rose at the time about the nature of science, about the nature of theorizing. So it has a significance for philosophers as well as for science. And the other thing was, of course, the political side to it, the nature of dissent. And Galileo was up against the authority of the church, and that was one of the aspects of the trial that was very interesting. I should say, when we did the retrial of Galileo, it wasn't a reenactment of the original trial. It was reopening the cold case.
Yeah.
And what we did was, it wasn't, there was no script. I got some celebrities, and they played comparable roles. I had a famous astronomer play Galileo, and I had a famous barrister play his defense counsel, and and a wonderful priest played the Pope, and another defrocked priest played Cardinal Bellarmine. So it was reopening the case. So I had to get legal advice on how to restate the charges in a modern court.
In a modern court.
And so we ran it as a modern trial, reopening the case. And what's rather interesting about it is, my own view is, and in fact, by the way, we brought out to Australia the world's leading Galileo scholar, Professor Maurice Finocchiaro. He was going to get on the witness stand, and we never managed to do that, but he was very disappointed. We found Galileo guilty. But I think we should have. He was upset because he thinks Galileo wasn't guilty. But actually, by the criteria, by the rules of the time, I think he was guilty. He knowingly kind of violated the injunctions that he was given. And he was a cheeky bugger. He upset. And by the way, given the context we're talking, the bad guys in the story are usually made out to be the church, but they weren't. It was the philosophers. It was us. It was our profession. The philosophers had it in for him because he made fun of them. They were stuck in their Aristotelian prejudices, and he would have public meetings, and he would ridicule them, and he got into trouble. And of course, they didn't like that, and they dobbed him in. They put him into the church and made charges against him, and the church sort of had no choice but to proceed against him. The church fathers loved him, and they wouldn't have, except for the fact that these Aristotelians, they were sore, and they had it in for him, and they did him in.
So it really was like a Socratic figure almost.
Well, it was exactly that. Yeah. And an interesting question about that in history, there are a couple of examples like this. So I think you might be interested in what might follow. And what might follow as that sort of thing was to put Socrates on trial.
Yeah.
That's my next project.
Oh, I would love that. I spent an entire term studying Plato last time. So.
But the interesting thing about both those cases is that they work because there is a case on both sides. Yeah. For Galileo, both the prosecution and the defense have a case. And so to resolve that today is interesting. And Socrates was put to death, of course.
Of course.
But as we know, because Plato presents it in a certain way, Socrates is the hero who was unfairly treated.
Resigned himself to it even.
Yeah, and allowed himself. That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
And so I need to, in fact, I had vaguely thought, I should say while we're talking about this, I have a version of this. I have written a stage play that is a version of the story of Socrates by abridging the dialogues. They're too long. I mean, you can't.
I wrote it.
Well, you know, the Republic is very large.
Yeah.
But I've reduced them all down to a theatre production where each, the Euthyphro, the Apology.
I love it.
I've made a theatre play out of them.
Yeah.
And each act is just one of the dialogues, ending, of course, with him drinking the hemlock. And the trial, of course, is Apology.
Yeah.
But so that's actually a theatre production I've done, which...
You've written it?
I've written it.
It's on.
I've got it. But that's separate from then a retrial. Yeah. So like the Galileo retrial, then we have to put him on the stand and do a mock reopening of the case as well. So those two things would make great theatre. And by the way, I should say, you know what's interesting about it, as in the case of Galileo? It's relevant because Socrates was the Chomsky of Athens. That's why I'm interested. He was standing up for certain fundamental principles, a dissident voice.
Yeah.
And that question of dissent, well, you know, you might say Chomsky is the Socrates of today.
Yeah.
And reviled, both revered and reviled.
Yeah.
And so that's why these cases are extremely interesting to play through because of the lessons to be learned from.
Definitely sensing a theme here,
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's good.
That's good.
I think that's
I'm glad we added those bits.
Yeah. We've got about 20 minutes to pack up, so that's why I was like...
No, good on you.
Yeah.
That last bit was good, huh?
Yeah, I really like that, yeah.
You can use those last bits, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think we'll figure a way to stitch, like, we'll probably have to reorganize, like, a few things to make sure, like, contextually that makes sense.
Yeah, but the last bit on Galileo and Socrates are good.
Yeah, I really hope... Yeah. I hope we actually see this production come to life.
Well, I've got to find... This is your job, guys. I actually tried to approach... So I'm not well connected to theatre. But so because I did a television retrial, I've got a sort of a credential. We could,
pitch it to someone.
Well, I could pitch it to the ABC again and see if, but the university would have to, like last time, put it on. We did it up in Clancy, and I got these big shots to come and do it, which was why the ABC got interested.
Oh, I see.
So we managed.
That happened first, and then...
No, I used to do it in class. So I used to do this with students for several years.
Are you still filming? All right, keep this. Yeah, I was just...
I used to run... Yeah, run this. This is good. I used to run...
Blipper reel.
I used to run a class on the Galileo affair. And each semester, at the end of the semester, we'd have a retrial with students.
Yeah.
And I'd get academic staff to come and play the witnesses, and because they sort of knew the story.
Yeah.
And by the way, I didn't mention, but so in this, somebody called me, it was the 400th anniversary of Galileo, and they said, can we do a public version? I said, right, but I'm not going to use students. I'm going to use celebrities. So you said, the thing was, I had to write they didn't know the story. So I wrote a treatment of each character and the story. So they read it, but there was no script. When they came out, you have to know when you watch this thing, they just ad-libbed it. They hammed it up. There was no script.
And because they were so good at their individual jobs in real life.
They knew the story, so they took on the role. Yeah. By the way, you know who played the Grand Duke of Tuscany?
No idea.
Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici.
Yeah.
Bob Carr. He was in the so he came and played. So it was a great thing to do.
Funny.
So now the question is, when I do the retrial of Socrates,
Who do you cast?
well, you know who I asked? Who should be Socrates? I asked Chomsky.
Oh.
And he said to me, he made a funny joke. You got to keep this on film. He said, he'd like to do it, but he hasn't got a snub nose. He made a joke. You have to have a snub nose.
All prosthetics,
Yeah. So that was but you see, the trick was to find somebody in real life who has that status of a dissident.
Absolutely, yeah.
Dissident, thoughtful, intellectual.
They've been method acting it the whole life.
Yeah.
At that point, yeah.
So it's not clear who would, other than Chomsky, be the outstanding dissident figure.
I'm sure we'll find someone.
Maybe I can think of a few. But then the other,
yourself.
no. But we find others that might fit that's what makes it so cute.
Yeah.
Where you've got these people in real life playing out this, and there's a lesson, as I say, for modern politics.
I love how creative it is. Yeah.
Yes, it has a lesson.
Yeah.
And so we have to think of who to play these parts.
Definitely.
But it was good getting the top barristers to. By the way, the barrister who was the prosecutor in the Galileo trial, Anna Katzman, she was promoted to being a judge in the court. And when she was inducted into being the judge, they gave her CV. It was some big formal proceedings. And they read her CV and they said, and the last prosecution she did was Galileo.
Oh, wow.
They called that out in her formal,
That's funny.
when they elevated her to the bench.
That's funny.
That's pretty cute.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah. All right.
Good on you.
very much.
Thanks for your interest and your questions.
Yeah.
Good on you.
Thank you for reciprocating.
No, it was good fun for me, and I'm grateful for the chance.
Absolutely.
So now everybody better buy my book.
Buy that book. Buy that book. This book. Buy it.